Before I start, this is just a reminder, Shit's Fucked is based on my own experiences with sobriety, mental health, and trauma. Each person's experiences and recovery is different. I hope you enjoy the podcast, but please note that I am not a medical professional. However, I hope to introduce you to resources and people who may be able to help. Welcome back to the Season 2 premiere of Shit's Fucked. It's your host, Paris, here, and I'm thrilled to be back with you for another season. Before we dive in, I just wanted to take a moment to reintroduce myself, as I did a pretty poor job doing that in the first season. So my name is Paris. I've battled alcohol addiction since age 13, struggled with methamphetamine at 20, and I also worked in the adult industry to support my habits from the age of 24 till 27, 28. I was diagnosed with BPD, also known as borderline personality disorder, and CPTSD, complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and I've come a long way. Now I'm 1 year sober from meth, and I have completely redefined my relationship with alcohol. Now I'm on a mission to discuss mental health and addiction, raising awareness and providing resources to help others build better lives through my own experiences alongside guests from the industry, so within the mental health and AOD sector, and others sharing lived experience stories. We'll tackle the tough topics, and it's in the hope of building a support network for those who struggle with addiction and mental health. So welcome, and let's dive into today's episode. Today we have a very special guest, Caroline Brunne, who is a survivor coach, a motivational speaker, an advocate, and an author. So welcome, Caroline. Thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
That's okay. So you're coming all the way from Queensland, right?
Yeah, I am. It's really I love the fact that we can, the power of the internet, even occasionally with a few tech hicks or tech challenges, we can do this from no matter where we are in the country, but also in the world, which is amazing.
Oh, absolutely. And look, there's always tech hiccups. Just for our listeners out there, we were having a bit of tech difficulties before we started, but we got there. We're here. It's all good.
Definitely. We want to make it as amazing for the listeners as possible. So testing internet and sound and all of these things have to be done.
Oh, it does. And look, I have unfortunately recorded way too many episodes that did have tech issues, and then I wasn't able to use it. So very important. Awesome. Okay, well, let's just kick right off straight into it. So the first question I'm going to ask you is, can you share with us a bit about your background and your experience as a survivor coach?
Yeah, definitely. Background. So I have lived experience as a survivor of child sexual abuse, incest, and family violence. And I guess that's the most important part of my story that kind of got me to where I am today, be it having this conversation with you or all of the other work that I do. I experienced abuse in my home from the age of 10, and for a really big part of my life, I didn't speak about my experience. So I guess from a professional perspective, I've done a lot of different things in my lifetime. But in 2020, I decided to disclose publicly. And I started by talking to family members and members in my people in my life first. And then that brought me to start writing my memoir in 2021, which you can see behind me. And then I self-published in 2022. So that really kicked off my newest part, this newest phase of my life. What's gone on from there is a lot of advocacy work, a lot of supporting people in this space. And that's what really drove me to try to find my place in the survivor space. So it was really important for me to find a way to support survivors, but specifically, I work a lot with survivors of child abuse because my story resonates with them, but I support survivors essentially anyone who has experienced any form of trauma, and trauma can be can come in lots of different shapes and sizes. So I've been working as a survivor coach only for the last kind of 12 months or so, and that's really been that grassroots style of work that I do, getting to work with fellow humans and getting to work with them as I support them on their journey to live their lives beyond trauma. So I guess to clarify what that is, if someone hasn't worked with a coach before, I would sit under the banner of a life coach. So I don't work with people in an active state of trauma. That's where you'd probably see a psychologist or a therapist or a counsellor. Those people have their role in the journey of healing. But people that are on a little bit more of a steadier foundation or are ready to focus on the present and work towards the future, that's what I work on with my clients, and how I got here today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for sharing. Sounds like you're doing some really amazing work out there in the community, so good on you. And I was going to say, actually, I'm really glad you brought up the fact that, you explained exactly what a coach is, and, you're not looking after people in active trauma, because it is really important for people to recognize that they need further assistance as well alongside coaching. So it's not just, it's not something to replace your psychologist or psychiatrist.
No, very much not. Like as someone who has a psychologist, it is not to replace your psychologist.
But it's a common thing that people aren't too sure of, So thank you so much for explaining that further. I think that was really, really good. So what would you say was the key motivation for you to specialize in working with trauma survivors? Obviously, you have your own story and, what your lived experience and what you've been through. But what was that key moment where you're like, you know what, I want to give back. I want to do this.
Yeah. I actually don't know if I can even pinpoint the moment. I think I avoided it for a really long time, to be perfectly honest with you. I know we're going to talk about a few things and a few phrases that will come in our discussion today, but I avoided this work for a very long time. I tried to distract anyone that came into my orbit with all the other things I could do, all the other things I could achieve, because I didn't want people to know about my trauma, and I didn't want people to know. I really didn't want people to feel sorry for me, and that was a thing that I kind of got stuck in for a really long time. Don't pity me, don't feel sorry for me. I look at all these amazing things that I can do. And though I am really proud of all my other achievements in my life, I realized that I love the phrase, and this is a phrase I learned in the business space, of the theory of you can't be what you can't see. And that lends itself to the business world, especially being a person of colour, a woman of colour. Here in Australia, one of the things I learnt really quickly in the business world was I needed to take every opportunity I could. If I was speaking on stage, if I was doing something amazing in my business, the more I could do that publicly, the more it would open doors for other women of colour, young girls of colour who could then go, oh, well, if Caroline can do it, then I can do it. It's all about that representation. When I sat and thought about trauma survivors properly, and when I really sat in the depths of that community, I realized the same theory applies. I felt really isolated in be it at the time of my experience or when I then moved further in and started kind of looking for other survivors that had similar stories to me, and I couldn't find them, because the reality is we're hidden often in our silence and the shame that we live, the cloud of shame that we live under. So I just thought to myself, well, if I can speak up and then support survivors from a coach perspective and share my lived experience, then there's going to be other survivors like me who need this kind of support, and they won't even know that it's out there if I'm not out there talking about it. So that was really the driver. You can't be, you don't even realize there's other incest survivors out there if no one's talking about it, unless it's like a sensationalist type situation. So in my kind of motivation, the more I talk about this, and therefore the more I support people as a coach, the more I open the door for other people to, take those further steps on their journeys of healing.
Oh, thank you. That was so beautiful. And look, I can definitely understand that shame perspective, I guess, coming from the perspective of an addict. A lot of us can get into our own bubbles, and and I just think, everything that you're doing is really incredible, and being that voice for those that have suffered, I think, is so important. So thank you. Thank you so much for being that voice. I'm so glad I have you on here today. So what would you say is the main mission that you're trying to achieve at the moment? I think we've touched on it a little bit already, but what would you say is that main mission?
Oh, the main, well, I don't know if there's a main one. I throw myself at a range of different things, and I'm working on some projects at the moment. But I guess the mission is always the same. The purpose of what I do is actually just, not even just, I hate that word, it minimizes everything. The purpose of what I do is to open the door for other survivors. And that may mean that someone sees something that I share, or hears this podcast, or reads one line, or someone shares a line from my book, or whatever the case may be, because I do a lot of things, and I put myself out there a lot in a really vulnerable way. I share a lot of really personal things that are hard to share. But if that means a survivor, be it speaks up and ends abuse, amazing, because some people are in active states of trauma and abuse, and or their children are, or other people in their lives are, and they intervene and they do something there. Or if they choose to disclose for the first time, that's probably been the most profound part of what has happened for me in the last few years, is when people reach out and they say, hey, that thing you said meant that I finally spoke up and shared this with a family member or a friend, or I shared it for the first time. And I'm blown away by that, because that is such a big step in that journey. So the mission hasn't changed. It's just opening the doors for survivors to no longer be silenced by the shame that doesn't belong to them.
Absolutely. And I think it's it's giving someone that, like you just don't know the impact that you can have on other people, really. And you never know who's listening to and what's going on in their world. And especially trauma survivors often sitting in that shame and that guilt do find it so difficult to speak up. And it's crazy. We don't recognize a lot of the time how much of an impact we can have on others just from speaking up. And that's really beautiful. It's beautiful to hear that you've had that experience, that other people have come to you and been able to connect and share as well. And it's given them the courage to then face that as well and speak up. So that's awesome.
It makes incredible. Like this work that we do, like you share publicly as well. And there are days where I'm like, what am I doing? This is hard. Like you feel the ripple effects of it when you get off the screen or whatever. It's really tough. And people, I think, can assume that, I don't know, that we enjoy it, or that it's really easy, or some kind of, like, I speak to other kind of real frontline advocates about this, and they're like, people think that this stuff is easy. I'm like, no, we know it's not. We know how much we're doing behind the scenes to keep ourselves together so we can show up. But those conversations, that when people go, that thing you said, or whatever else, I'm like, that's the stuff that makes it worthwhile. Like, that's the stuff.
Absolutely.
I myself out there.
Yeah, I even find for myself, what I went through, my lived experience, it drives my purpose forward. So that's my motivator. And I think that's why I don't allow myself to crumble, I guess, repeatedly after talking about this stuff so often. I just remind myself, like, bigger picture, this is what I'm trying to do. And I just want to help other people heal, like, through, I put purpose to what I've been through, so no, that's awesome. That's really cool. But today particularly, we're going to discuss high functioning trauma survivors and how this can show up in our lives, often subconsciously. So how do you define a high functioning trauma survivor, and what are some common characteristics to look out for?
Well, when I even think about the context of the things you talk about in regards to addiction, there's probably elements that can even lend themselves to people that are addicted to substances, because we've seen high functioning addicts. We know that they exist. We know that they get through life where they may be consuming copious amounts of whatever their drug or alcohol or poison of choice is, and they're still going to work and they're still doing their thing, and whatever the case may be, and they're high functioning in a whole nother way. And when I first started talking about being a high functioning trauma survivor, I shared that as a child, like I was, smoking cigarettes at 10, 11.
Wow.
Yeah, like that's not great. I'm not a smoker now. And I have an 11-year-old.
Good for you.
Him, like walking through the house reeking of cigarette, I'd be like, what are you doing?
Oh my goodness.
But yeah, like I dabbled with drugs, in my really early teens. I think the moment I hit high school, and alcohol, and it was almost like by the time I got to my late teens, by the time I kind of got to like year 10, I was like, oh, it's so old news. Like I was just done with it. It was like I did that really early. Now I'm not saying I'm laughing about it. We're laughing about it, but they're not normal traits for a young person.
No, not at all.
But I guess in my case, I identified really quickly that what I needed, being in a really active state of trauma, was not necessarily numbing. I needed control. So control was more important to me than the disassociation and the numbing that came with the substance abuse. So I let that go pretty quickly, because I knew I wasn't in control when I was under the influence. So I then had to find other ways to still numb, because there was still stuff going on that I was still experiencing trauma. So
I mean, trauma and addiction go hand in hand.
Oh my goodness, definitely. So not even in a conscious way, I just, because I wanted control, I started busying myself. And that was my way of being a high functioning trauma survivor. So I went from, and I'd always been a pretty organized child, but I then went on to just take on lots of projects and always be the person that would organize things for my social group. And that just accelerated and lent itself to me working in industries. Like I worked in the events industry for a very long time. The busier you were, the more hours you did, the more you were rewarded for that. And so it was almost like finding a new addiction. It was finding a new way to numb my body with copious amounts of work and ridiculous hours, and just taking on another thing and another thing. But the difference was that no one was ever going to tell me to stop. Like I was making life easier for everyone. So I was rewarded and applauded for that. And once again, it was about being high functioning. So the harder things got emotionally from a trauma perspective, the more I put on my plate, and the more that I functioned as a high functioning trauma survivor, because I looked so successful. Now that's just one example of, and I'm speaking about my own experience because that's the easiest way of explaining that to people. But there's a line in my book, and I remember we were talking about this at my book launch years ago, and the MC who was interviewing me on the day, she's like, oh, there's this line I want to read out, and it essentially says, I can never quote myself exactly because who remembers the things they say, but it essentially says something along the lines of, being busy is a great form of armor when you're experiencing or you're trying to hide from your trauma. And I was like, and she said, at the time I was just listening to what she was saying because I didn't know she was going to read this quote, and she said she heard audible like gasps in the audience because people realized, they're like, oh my goodness, I do that. And they realized that that's a thing they do. It's a really good way of armoring up, not letting people get too close to you because you're too busy. And not only are you busy, but people are like, man, you're so great, you get everything done. So so it's just one way of high functioning trauma survivors. But when I speak about this, especially at conferences and things, I get you see the nods in the audience, you often can pick those people, you can see them because they're normally top of their field. And then when you really sit down and have a conversation with them and they're like, oh, this happened to me, or I was subjected to this, or blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, yeah, that makes sense. That's why that's why you're as good as you are, because you've worked out a way to numb from that by doing something that's really socially acceptable.
Absolutely. And I think as well with busyness, it's often viewed as being successful, right? So like when people are, being, I shouldn't say being slow, but slowing down and, not being as proactive in that sense, people view it as lazy. So you don't even get questioned for being as busy.
So people question me now because I've pointed it out to them, and they'll be like, are you sure you should be? And I'm like, yep, I'm like, really valid call. And then I'll kind of go, okay, sometimes I need that. Sometimes the people that like in my circle that I will listen to when they say, hey, how are you going with that thing? Now that I've pointed it out to them. But, in general, people will just go, oh, you're so accomplished versus, are you sure you're not about to burn out?
Yes, absolutely. And I can think of many people off the top of my head who fit this description so well, who I know have experienced, a lot of trauma in their life, and they are just absolute busybodies, and they're running around, burning themselves out. So I think it's a really important discussion to have, to start recognizing what that actually is a lot of the time. Like
what does it mean? Like why are you doing this?
Yes. Let's have a look at this further.
And it's probably in a similar way to, I can think even at times in my life where I would come home and have a glass of wine that would turn into another glass of wine that would turn into whatever, and I'd be like, why am I doing this? Like, what is it solving for me? And so, like, years ago, I found myself in this bit of a loop around alcohol and stress. So I'd have a really busy day at work because I took on all the busy things, and then to slow down, I would have a glass of wine with dinner, but then maybe one after dinner and whatever else, and that would escalate. And then I got to the point where I was like, wait, how can I teach myself to process and manage stress that is all self-imposed because I'm being busy, because I'm trying not to think about my trauma? Like, it's a bit of a ripple effect there. But and there was a year that I took a year off alcohol because I was like, I need to teach myself how to do things that I need better coping mechanisms for my stress. And so it was really fascinating to do that, because I wasn't at the point where I would have said that I had an alcohol problem, hence why I could just kind of flick the switch and take a whole year off. But I had worked out very quickly that I was using it to deal with stress. And it's the same with being busy. So if you're the first person to put your hand up for the thing, ask yourself why. Because if you don't really want to do the thing, then why are you doing it?
Yes, and this is something that I've learned a lot in my own recovery journey, and I often challenge my friends who don't like it at all, I'll tell you that. I'll often challenge them, why are you coming home and going for that glass of wine? And it's because they're not regulated, like they're dysregulated, and they have developed that self-limiting belief, like, if I have this wine or this drink, like, that's my wind down, I deserve it, like this is how I relax. But it's a conversation I have with my friends a lot. Let's look at what's causing this issue. Like, why are you so dysregulated? How can we regulate your nervous system without the use of alcohol? And so that's great that you had that self-awareness. So many people are just blinded to that, like they have no awareness of it at all. It's so socially acceptable as well. It's such a norm.
Oh, definitely. Very much so. And it's almost, once again, it's similar to what I was saying about being busy. Like in the corporate world, in the business world, if you go to a networking event and you don't have a drink, you're the strange one. Like, if your answer to how are you isn't, a bit busy, but I'm okay. That's not a feeling. Busy isn't a feeling. Like, that's not how you answer how are you. But it's glorified. It's a hustle culture. And then when you overlay that, I'm like, that's another podcast for another day.
Sure, we can go there.
And don't get me wrong, like, I lived and breathed the hustle culture because, my goodness, it was a good way to hide trauma.
Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, goodness. So what would you say, how does busyness manifest as a coping mechanism?
Yeah, I think for me, as I said, I'm naturally an organized person. It's one of those things that some people are organized, some people are just not. So for me, that kind of manifested automatically. But busyness is, as I was saying before, it's the moment that you keep saying yes. You have no boundaries. Boundaries form a really big part of that busyness or the opposite of.
Yes.
So you're constantly saying yes to things. Like I'm a parent, so I've got 2 children, and I've definitely had stages where I was on every committee at school and I'd put my hand up for all the, like, I never want to go to any of these things, let alone organize these things. It's just, it manifests in lots of different ways. And I'm using my own examples, but I've seen this with other people as well, where they are just putting their hand up. And it may not be like in that kind of sense of volunteering for things. It may be that you become really kind of tunnel vision and obsessive about certain things that you do. So you may find that you pick up a hobby and then you can completely consume yourself in it because you want to busy yourself in it. Now, I'm mindful that there are certain traits of, being neurodivergent that lend themselves to these behaviors. And I'm not implying in any way that if you hyper-focus on a new hobby, that means you have trauma. I'm not linking those two, and I want to really clarify that as someone like my son is neurodivergent, and so I'm really mindful of not kind of, I really hate it when people go, oh, we can excuse that behavior because that person is neurodivergent. I'm like, hey, people don't need to be assholes because they're neurodivergent. That's not how that works. Like, so I'm always really quick to clarify that I'm not just throwing everyone in a neurodivergent bucket.
Of course,
but
yes.
There are definitely moments where you see yourself kind of focusing on something, busying yourself with it, going to every single thing, even when people get super obsessed with working out or running or whatever else. And there's a point where because you're pushing so hard, and it's the burnout feeling. You feel it in your body that you are about to burn out. And that could be physically because you have gone to the gym twice a day for 6 months and your body is like, I can't do this anymore. It's just keeping you busy. It's essentially numbing you from the things you're trying not to face. Yeah, so it doesn't have to be work. Like I keep using the examples of work because like when we can picture that person that's always busy and always has a project on and whatever. But once again, if you're exercising, going to the gym, no one's going to tell you that's a bad thing. No one's going to tell you not to be healthy. No one's going to tell you not to go for that run.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
Yeah, there's a line.
Yeah,
the line's different for everyone as well.
Yeah, I've definitely seen some other people, for example, I'm going to throw my mum under the bus here. Hello, Linda. How are you doing? She's someone that has to always be socially busy. Like she has more of a social life than I do. I barely do anything these days, but my mum, like she's out at concerts, she's catching up with the gals, she's just constantly doing something. And I often ask her, I'm like, when are you slowing down? Like, when are you giving yourself time? But yeah, it's definitely something that I've noticed that she does. And she definitely has experienced a lot of trauma in her life. So it's made me think, I wonder if she's a bit of a high functioning trauma survivor herself, just in the way that she manages her social life. And I've seen that a lot with friends as well. Very busy, socialized, got something on every single day. I used to be the same. And now I do nothing. I love my nights in. I don't want to leave that.
Yeah, no, I get you. I'm a bit the same.
Oh, goodness. So what would you say are some potential challenges or pitfalls associated with constantly being busy?
Yeah. Well, it's the burnout. It's not sustainable long term. And there's a couple of things that start happening. So if we're using the kind of business setting or the workplace setting, eventually stuff starts to slip. Like if you put that much stuff on your plate, something's got to give. So the detail gets missed, or you can't be everything to everyone, and so something's got to give. Sometimes that starts if you start being, if you're constantly trying to be busy in the workplace, as an example, it might start to affect your personal relationships because you keep saying yes to all these other things and you don't have time for people that actually want to spend time with you. It could be, as I said, the gym or a fitness kind of example where your body starts to experience that fatigue and that burnout because it just physically cannot take additional strain. Something's got to give eventually. And even when I go back to that example of being in a state of addiction, something's got to give. Like your body eventually starts going, no, I can't physically do this anymore. So they're normally the signs. If you're good at it, I say that in inverted commas, you'll find another way. So if you're not ready to face the thing yet, you'll either, just ease back for a little bit and go again, or you'll have an argument with the person that's like, hey, I think it'd be nice to have a weekend where you didn't, do extra work for work or whatever, and you'll argue with that person because they don't understand how busy you are, and don't you see how much I'm trying to achieve? Like there's lots of things that will come up. You can see all the examples. You're laughing because you're like, I know these conversations.
Yeah.
You're like, I had those.
I'm nodding along. I'm laughing. I'm like, oh yeah, been there.
Yeah. Like the examples I'm giving, everyone's like, oh yes. But we all have them. They're normally the signs. Burnout can be experienced in lots of different ways, and even just mental burnout, like in the sense of your brain just gets to the point where it cannot absorb any more information. You can't have another question thrown at you. You don't have the answers, and things start to drop. And for someone who is trying to excel at this, who is trying to show that you've got your shit together, when you start dropping the ball and you don't, that creates a whole nother problem, which then compounds the burnout. So yeah, we all have experienced those examples. That's why you're laughing. But yeah, we've had those conversations. Like, yeah, when people call you out on stuff and you react in that real defensive way, it's normally a time to maybe stand back and go, why am I being defensive about this?
Absolutely. And I remember even for myself, when I used to keep myself insanely busy, like every single day, very much like Mama Linda, I would get to a point where, you're right in the sense that your body just can't cope anymore, or your mind can't cope anymore. And I would just have this huge shutdown, and I would get physically sick. I'd get really, really ill, usually like tonsillitis or something like that. And then I would have a complete mental breakdown. So I would have to shut myself down to a point where I'm turning my phone off for a week or two, because I cannot actually talk to anyone. I can't do anything. I've just stopped. But then
it's a 0 to 100 kind of situation. You're either full on, like you're at 100, or when you stop, you fall into it, and your body goes, okay, I'm going to make you sick now, so you have to stop. And you go back down to 0, and then you rest, and then you somehow convince yourself to go straight back to 100 again.
And that's exactly what I did. I would go so ham for ages, and then I would have this absolute crash, and then I'd come good again and be like, oh, I just wasn't looking after my mental health as well. Like, I'm good now, though. I've recharged.
Yeah.
Right back at it.
Yeah.
Oh, goodness. So can you elaborate on the difficulties a trauma survivor may face when trying to be like still and present? Like, can this have a ripple effect into our relationships and our self-care, which we briefly just spoke about this, but yes, interesting to hear what you got to say.
Yeah, I think what's interesting is, even as I was talking before about the examples of like when we're at 100 and we're racing around, we're doing the thing. I personally, from my own experience, know that I did that because I really didn't like being in my own stillness and my own, sometimes even my own company. So if the thought of like sitting still for long enough meant I didn't know what was going to come next, or I had to feel a feeling that I didn't want to feel, or have a conversation that I didn't want to have, if you don't make space, there's no space for that. Now, as we know, it's not sustainable, and we've very clearly established that. But the alternative to being in that state of slowing down, and we know that there's some, I guess, misconceptions around, being slower means that you must be lazy or whatever. We know that's a bit of a societal thing, but the slowing down to the point where you can sit still in your own company or the company of the people that are closest to you, that's terrifying for a trauma survivor. Initially, sometimes, eventually, in a good place with good support along that healing journey, it gets easier, and then hopefully it gets to the point where you enjoy it. But initially it's terrifying because there's a real sense of trust that is needed in yourself to sit in your own company and in the people around you. And the reality is, as trauma survivors, the reason why we are survivors is because we've been subjected to something that has caused us some state of trauma. And it is normally at the hands of another person. I do work with trauma survivors who have overcome illness. That's obviously a very different type of trauma. But even then, sometimes there's additional trauma on top of that for them because of the way people reacted or the way people treated them when they were unwell or whatever else. So it's as humans, there's still some transference there from a human to human interaction. The difficulty around sitting still is really hard, because if you are still for long enough, you begin to feel things that you may not have the capacity, the will, or the support mechanisms in place to feel them. And once you know that they're there and they're waiting for you, those feelings are waiting for you, you either choose to be with them, or you continue to go back to being at 100 sort of thing. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I can really relate to that in the sense that for a long time, I used to hide from my own traumas, and I used drugs and alcohol as my coping mechanism. And I remember just trying to, anytime that uncomfortable feeling would pop up, and there was that moment where I'm like, oh my goodness, I have to face this. It was so much easier to just turn to something to take that away immediately than for me to just sit there and deal with it. And so that's what kept me in the cycle of addiction for so long, like years and years, because I was so scared to death of that uncomfortable feeling. And it took a lot of time for me to get to a point when I have no fear about it anymore. I face it and I deal with it. It's not as scary now that I've looked underneath the mask. I know what's there, and I know what I'm capable of now. I've built that trust within myself, and I know I can deal with it. But years of CBT, DBT, constant support, ensuring you've got that support network around you, and yes, building that trust. I think that was a really key element for me to get to where I am today. So yes, definitely. I can completely relate to what you were talking about. Oh goodness. How can individuals who are resonating with what we're discussing here today, how could they start the journey to seeking help?
You mentioned just then trust, and that is the first foundational piece in my opinion. We have to trust ourselves first. And sometimes I feel that survivors trust themselves, but in a way that's a bit of an all or nothing. So I personally was like, when I was a lot younger, in a real state of anger, was like, I'm the only person I can trust, and I can only rely on myself, which also fed into that busyness. I'll have to do it myself because I can't trust anyone else to do anything, because when I trust others, I get hurt. Now, there's that version of trust, which is really loaded with anger, and rightly so. I understand if there are people that are still in that state. I know why you're there. I've lived it myself. But there's a different type of trust that is a lot there's just more stillness to that. So just trusting yourself that you can actually sit in the emotions that are coming up for you, and that you've got the skills within yourself to be with them and to seek the support that you need for you. So I guess as a starting point, thinking about that self-trust, before you even go and look, before you hit Google and you start doing the searches, start just spending time with yourself. Now, that could just be a 5-minute journaling process at the start or the end of the day. That could be a walk around the block by yourself, preferably not with like a distracting podcast like this podcast. Listen to this one and then turn it off, and then don't listen to anything else. But try not to have distractions. So no music, no, just be in the element of where you are. Just trying to have these moments where you are with yourself and start trusting that you've got you, not from a place of anger, not from a place of revenge, not from a place of, even the other end, like a longing for, acceptance or love or whatever. Like there's so many ranges of where this can come from, just from a place that you've got you and that you trust you. And that's probably the first step, because when you go and seek support externally, you're going to be met with lots of different things. There's so many different types of therapy out there. There's then, coaches, there's groups, there's individual stuff, there's like somatic stuff, there's stuff for the body. There's just so many different things. And some are going to work for you and some are not. But when you've got you, you can listen to that voice and you can really tune into that intuition and go, nope, this one isn't working for me, but this is feeding me and I get it and it's good and it's working for me. But until you tune into you, you're not really, like, you could end up bouncing around a little bit. You might bounce around for a little bit less if you have those practices that you do for yourself. And if you've got those practices that you do them for yourself, you can take those anywhere. Like if you know that you can grab a piece of paper or even the notes app on your phone or whatever you need to do so you can write something, process how you're feeling, and you've got the power to do that. You don't need a coach, a paid coach, a therapist, whatever, because you've got you. So that's the first step. Like I'd love to sell you 50 million things, but that's not my job because you've got the power to do all the things that you need as a foundation.
Absolutely. And I think it's so true. You do really need to start developing that trust within yourself. I know for me, I kind of went the opposite way. I went to see a psychologist first, but because I wasn't really, I don't know, I definitely wasn't trusting myself. And I was, to be fair, lying a lot to my psychologist. I was turning up to appointments under the influence. I got kicked out of one because of that. And I don't know, I was just in a really strange space. I just was finding everything very difficult, but slowly learning mindfulness practices and learning to slow down and to be present. That was where I was able to start hearing myself more and my own intuition. Everything was starting to become a little bit more quieter, and slowly, that trust did come. So yeah, I think that's a really important first step. Even though I didn't do it that way, but everyone's journey.
You got there in the end.
I got there in the end. Yeah, it took a while. It took a hot minute, but got there. Now I'm going to be mindful of our time. I know we're running out of a little bit of time, so I wanted to quickly kind of go over your services that you currently have on offer at the moment and what that entails, and then we'll discuss a little bit more about some of the moves you've been making in Parliament House, and we'll wrap it up there. So how about you start off with your services and what you've got on offer at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. So I guess for your listeners, the main service that's going to resonate most with people is my coach offering. So I have 2 different types of coaching series programs. One is a 3-month commitment, one is a 6-month commitment. hence why I clarified the difference between a coach and a counselor or whatever else. So I work with clients who are working on the present into the future. It's very goals, values, boundaries focused. And it's to support you to look at your life beyond trauma. So sometimes we don't even talk about trauma, and that's completely okay. I have an understanding of what you're bringing into the space, but we focus on whatever you want to focus on moving forward. So that's definitely the main service offering. I also am a public speaker, so I speak at small events, so lots of small community groups and things like that, where people are looking for that more small, intimate, real grassroots perspective. But I also speak at conferences and that sort of stuff. So if you're an organizer of some sort and you're looking for a new speaker, that's definitely something that I can do. But I would say, and I guess this goes back to the last thing I shared about trusting yourself, one of the things that I do that I'm really passionate about is I share lots on my social media, and I do that in a way that means that people can have access to information and ideas and thoughts. I also write blogs on my website. I do that so people can have free resources, because I understand not everyone can afford a coach. And I understand that even if you're trying to see a psychologist or something, the wait list can be really long. And so sometimes just reading something or getting a better understanding of a few different perspectives, once again, those voices and having representation. So if what I'm saying has resonated and you think, oh, I'd love to hear more from Caroline, but I really can't afford coaching, that's totally cool. I connect with my community all the time online and try to provide support wherever I can, because I know that we're all in this together as survivors, and that's the most important part for me.
Awesome. That's amazing. And I will share links to all your socials with our listeners, so that will all be available. So keep an eye out for that. Now, the last thing that we'll talk about quickly before we have to jet. So I hear you've been making some moves in Parliament House in Victoria with the Australian Childhood Foundation. Tell us a little bit about what you've been up to.
Yeah, so I joined the Lived Experience Advisory Committee for a project that was originally named as Emma's Project. It launched a few years ago now at a conference, or around the time of the Australian Childhood Foundation runs a large national conference. And Emma had gone to the foundation to say, hey, I want to do some more in this space in regards to child sexual abuse, and that is why they started the campaign to create Emma's Project. What went on from there is there was a survey done. They got a range of survey respondents to share their thoughts and what could have helped them as children and what they think needs to change. From there, they created the Lived Experience Advisory Committee, which I'm a part of. So a small selection of people were selected to join a committee and look at how we wanted to implement some of the recommendations that came from the survey, so from survivors, from lived experienced contributors. And so last week we launched the first project in the first phase of the campaign, and we launched it in Victoria as a starting point, hopefully to be launched nationally. And what we're doing is requesting that there is mandatory training included into the Working with Children check process. So right now there's no training required to apply for a Working with Children check, and because of that it means that there's no training to prevent child sexual abuse or child abuse at all. We know as survivors that if we had had safe adults around us, and that's I think even in my experience, the abuse was happening in the home, but my behavior in the classroom, no 10-year-old should be smoking cigarettes. Like if I was walking into the classroom at a 10, 11-year-old and I smelled like cigarette, a teacher should have picked that up. And with the training that we are requesting to be put in place for a Working with Children check, that would mean that a teacher would have gone, something's not right. I need to investigate this. I need to ask more questions. And that's the kind of training we want in place. Right now, as long as you don't have a criminal record, you can get a Working with Children check. And that's kind of the case right around the country. The next part I personally believe in is that we need to all be singing from the same song sheet. Every state has a different application process. It all is very similar, and from my understanding, most states have mandatory training. So we did a press conference at Parliament House in Victoria. We have some ministers that are already backing us, which is great. So if people want to have a look at the campaign and also read the report is incredible. It takes the survey respondents, it has some incredible data in it, and it's from lived experience contributors, which I think is the part that I am most passionate about. So all they need to do is go to childhood.org.au. They can read the report there, and then they can fill out, we've made it really easy, you just fill out your details at the bottom. You can add anything additional. So the more that you can share from your own experience, or even why you think this is important, the more personalized you can make it, the better, but it's not super complicated. Postcode, name, fill in the details, send it off. That goes to the ministers, and the more people we can have getting behind this, the more noise we can make to get them to make this change.
That's incredible. And I will make sure that I post those links as well. Do you have to be based in Victoria to apply or to contribute to this?
You don't technically. We, at this stage, we know that Victorian postcodes and Victorian residents are going to have more weight in this conversation because we're talking about that. But the good thing is if the Victorian ministers are getting pressure from people all around the country, then they're going to be paying attention, because then there's going to be more push to get this over the line, and then hopefully lead the way for the rest of the states to do the same.
Amazing. Oh, perfect. Well, I will definitely send that through to our listeners and make sure that that's available for people to be able to jump on and have a look at and even contribute. But thank you so much, Caroline, for coming on today. I had such a great conversation with you. I mean, heavy topics, but it's so needed to talk about. And I think we discussed a lot of things that I think there will be a few aha moments.
Very relatable. Like when I talked about arguing with partners, everyone went, oh, so I do that.
Oh, thank you so much for everything that you're doing. You should be so damn proud of yourself. I'm proud of you, and I can't wait to see what else you get up to. I'll be definitely hyping for you from WA.
Thanks so much, Paris. It was lovely chatting with you.
No worries. All right. Thank you so much for coming on. See ya.
Bye.